Shri Sachin Pilot, Professor Naresh Dinesh, Professor Shashi Sahai, friends. As you can imagine, it's truly intimidating and humbling for me to be here. I grew up on this campus and probably still know every stone in this building better than most of you around here, because we explored it in ways in which I think is not accessible to professors. I'm sure there's some graffiti around that we could still recall. I'm also eternally grateful to this campus for two things, which is what makes this occasion even more intimidating for me, which is first, a first-rate intellectual education. I was, I think, fortunate enough to be growing at a moment where Rajasthan University was truly a national force and an international force to be reckoned with. And if you want to take one measure of progress for the state of Rajasthan, and I'm especially appealing to the young students there, when the next election comes, just ask the question, which political party has a better plan for the regeneration and rejuvenation for Rajasthan University to greater heights? That political party will be the party that can take India forward. Simple test for you. But the second thing I realized growing up on Rajasthan University campus was this was an absolutely wonderful school in which to actually learn about actual politics. I think Sachin Pilot has it easy. If you have witnessed university politics as a child, I suspect that's the best kind of training you can have in the study of political science and politics. Now, the mandate that was given to me is, this is a keynote to a ULP program. So I guess the task is to set a little bit of a framework for a very broad subject, institutions and processes. What I'll do in the next half an hour or so is just briefly talk about 4 major transitions that I think India needs to undergo if it is to have not just a successful democracy, but in a sense fulfill the aspirations of all the young people in this room and the generations to come. Right? There are, of course, many other transitions one can talk about, but I hope it will be apparent why I'm picking on these 4 transitions, because to my mind, at this political juncture, and at this juncture in India's history, these transitions are critical. They hold the key to, in a sense, everything else happening in our politics, in our society, and in our democracy. And I must say, just as a prefatory remark before I get into the main argument, I will, professionally, as Naresh Dinesh said, sort of professors are very good at pontificating and they're very good at articulating problems. They rarely have solutions. And I think in a democracy, that's how it should be. I would be very worried if we lived in a democracy where professors actually profess solutions. I think solutions have to come through the hard work of political negotiation, as I'll talk about towards the end of this talk. But hopefully what we can do is have a very clear-eyed perspective of where the challenge is. I must also say that, and I'll just be open about this, that at this historical juncture, I am feeling increasingly pessimistic about India's prospects. Okay? There is no shortage of energy and talent in this country, evidenced in this room. But the structural problems that are piling up in Indian democracy and the Indian economy, to my mind, are becoming more insurmountable and more difficult by the day. Right? Indian democracy and the prosperity of future generations has been living on borrowed time. We keep deferring problems down the road. But as a wits once said, remember Keynes said that in the long run we are all dead? The reverse is also true, that at some point the long run also catches up with you. And Indian democracy is at that critical point where the long term has caught up with us. If we do business as usual, we will not have the jobs for the millions of young people entering the job market. I'm sure many in this room are experiencing that angst. If we do business as usual, our footprint on global affairs, right, will be what it is currently, which is very, very minuscule, despite all the changes and all the sort of, public adulation that India gets, right? Even if we grow at 7 to 8% a year for 10 to 15 years, our living standards, per capita standards, will be 1/6 of China's. Right? Just think of the enormity of the challenge we are facing. Business as usual is not possible. And what are the 4 particular dimensions on which business as usual is not possible, and the way in which those dimensions affect our democracy? That's what I'm going to talk about in the next 25 minutes or so. So let me begin with a stylized fact about our contemporary economic moment, which goes to the heart of our politics. Many of you know, for the last 3 to 4 years, there has been much talk about the slowdown of the Indian economy, right? And of course, the slowdown is a relative term. Compared to most emerging market economies in the world, India is doing relatively better. 7% on the new GDP data. If you use the old GDP data, 5.5%. But compared to what we can be doing, compared to what we should be doing and what we need to be doing, if we are to generate enough jobs, right? This is clearly a disappointing performance with no real sense of what our trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be, right? I mean, India at the minimum needs to do 8% a year, right, if it is to generate enough jobs. As you know, most of you in this room know, one of the profoundest facts that is going to shape the lives of the young people in this room is that the employment elasticity of capital is falling globally. Right? Industrialization, development is becoming more capital intensive. We are at the cusp of a technological revolution whose effect on jobs and job creation, we are barely beginning to understand. Even China is beginning to struggle with that problem. Right? So we are living at the cusp of as it were, a technological and economic change where the relationship between capital and employment is probably not going to follow the easy pathways that we have seen over the last 15, 20 years. 2004, 2005, we begin to acquire this confidence. India can grow at 8%. In fact, we came to believe 8% growth was our birthright, right? Savings rate of 35%, investment rate of roughly 35%, a young population with a shrinking workforce because more people are staying longer in school. What can go wrong with India? Right? In fact, I hate to say this, but during UPA, particularly UPA 2, if you went to planning commission meetings, there was almost this sense of fatality about 8% growth. And you know what? It all vanished. Right? The last election was fought on, amongst various different issues, corruption and so forth, a sense of anxiety. Our sense of the economy is not apocalyptic. As I said, we are chugging along, and in UPA 2 we also sort of chugged along. But there is beginning to be a palpable sense of anxiety about what India's economic prospects look like. And the first truth of any democracy and any institutional arrangement is, if the economy tanks, if the economy collapses, if the economy does not live up to its potential, right, you will find all kinds of social conflicts arising in its wake. Economic growth is not a panacea to everything, it's not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition to keeping people's allegiances in the democratic system. Okay? So, where have we gone wrong? Now, the first and the most basic transition that we are facing, right? We could argue we've been facing this since 1991, is the relationship between state and capital in Indian democracy. Okay? This is an issue globally. You can have a parallel conversation about the United States, you can have a parallel conversation about Europe, right? But there is a peculiar intensity to the relationship between state and capital in India that I think we haven't still got our political heads around. And what is the best way of capturing this relationship? 1991, India began to liberalize, and certainly we got very good at thinking about what are the areas of particularly production that the state needs to get out of. Right? This was the revolution Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh ushered. A kind of paradigm shift in thinking about state-capital relations in India. And the basic idea was you free up the private sector, right, to unleash its productive energies. That productive energy will generate growth, which translates into higher government revenue. Higher government revenue can then be used to bring into the fold all those who are left out of this process of participation in the economy. Very simple social contract. You don't have to be too kind of complicated about it, right? Now, what happened post-1991? Certainly the Indian economy liberalized, and on the back of that liberalization, and I'll defend that liberalization, against its critics, it created the possibilities of growth. We had a near decade of 7 to 8% growth, right? That growth did translate into enhanced revenues, which for the first time created the possibility of a deep and robust welfare state in India. And let it be clear, no democracy can survive without a deep and robust welfare state. I think the UPA was exactly right about this. Right? So growth created the conditions of that possibility. But then growth began to slow down. And one way of thinking about what happened in that period, which is very directly related to questions around corruption and so forth. All political economy problems ultimately come down to problems of corruption. Think about the Indian economy right now, and three stylized facts will stand out. The first stylized fact is, while we liberalized the process of production, industry is certainly freer than it was pre-1991. We did not have a robust, transparent framework for factor markets in India, right? Now, what does that mean in concrete terms? It means in concrete terms, if you look at land, if you look at natural resources, if you look at even education and health, I'll come to that in a minute. You have roughly 40 to 50% of the Indian economy where you still do not have a clear and transparent pricing mechanism. Okay? In the old days, if the market could not work, we could just impose state-administered prices. Right? The state could decide you're going to get coal at this price, you're going to get iron ore at this price. Right? That regime, for a variety of reasons I'll come to, is in a sense no longer possible. Right? But fundamentally, you still have an economy, right, where there is a cloud over the pricing mechanism of a large number of factors of production. Okay? One stylized fact, I'll just put it out there. It needs elaboration, but I'll just put it out there. Second stylized and related fact: Indian economy now has the most over-leveraged and indebted capitalist class in the world. Okay? 2009, when the financial crisis broke, we patted ourselves on the back. Indian banking system is so robust, it has weathered the global financial crisis. Guess what? It turns out that the financial condition of Indian banks was far, far worse than anybody either anticipated or even acknowledged in government. Okay? We are in the midst of a banking crisis as we speak. Okay? Second, in a sense, just sort of stylized fact. And the third and related stylized fact is not only do you have greater indebtedness of the Indian private sector, right? You also have the most credit concentration of any Indian banking system in the world. Any banking system in the world, right? Now you put all of these together, and what is the picture of the economy you see? The picture of the economy is that this is and still remains, to a certain degree, a crony capitalist economy through and through. Okay? The first major transition that India needs to make is, can we move from the transition from a crony capitalist economy to a well-regulated market economy? Okay? Very simple transition. I mean, simple to conceptualize, not easy to effect, right? What are the conditions under which crony capitalism, where almost all the factors of production, right? There's a joke going around that after the license permit Raj, there were 3 areas that remained in the hands of government for rent seeking, which were land, liquor, and learning. And liquor is also considered a factor of production in some ways. But you can say land, liquor, learning, even credit, right? The single most important factor of production, right? Remained entirely subject to a regime open to manipulation, right? And we are now in this political economy trap with no clear pathway of moving out of it. For a very interesting reason. I think the government recognizes this trap. I think governments are, as a result of the kind of anti-corruption protests we saw, a little bit more paranoid about major scandals breaking out. I'm not saying all kinds of corruption has come down, but certainly there's a lot more political paranoia about the vulnerability that major corruption scandals might produce, right? Nevertheless, right, it's not clear that either the state has the capacity to reset these relations in ways that signal a transition to a well-regulated capitalism. And I will say this from the other side, it's not clear that Indian capital is yet ready to play by, as it were, the rules of a well-regulated capitalism. So when you have an economy with thousands of crores of stuck assets, right? Because either they have been over-leveraged or your regulatory system is not clear, one way in which you can get out of that trap is by the state and capital conducting negotiations, right? I mean, we actually, for example, in the power sector, we have actually excess power generation capacity right now, for example, right? But who will conduct those good faith negotiations? The government is afraid that if it gives the private sector some haircuts, allows them to restructure these loans, the accountability pressures of civil society will actually, in a sense, question the motives behind that deal. Private capital, on the other hand, right, is not yet waking up to the fact that Indian economy cannot be run on business as usual, right, where politicians are in your pocket in the same old-fashioned way that they used to be. Right? So the first transition I'll just register is, what are the conditions under which India can undergo a transition from crony capitalism to well-regulated capitalism? Okay. Right now we are stuck. You know, there used to be that, somebody had coined this poem about, actually Jawaharlal Nehru, oddly enough. Nahi inkar ka alam hai, nahi ikrar ka alam hai. Right? So we are not slipping back. The condition is not apocalyptic. But there are as yet no signs of the creation of a transparent and sustainable regulatory regime. Okay? That's transition number 1. The second transition, which is related to this, is one of the profoundest changes that happened in India over the last 5 to 10 years. Right? And this is related to a point Professor Dadich was making about, in the sense, the decline of the political parties. Is that the fundamental architecture of governance in India has started to be questioned. If I were to simplify the story a bit, the old administrative architecture that India not just inherited, but all political parties connived to perpetuate, was based on some elementary principles. The first elementary principle was vertical accountability instead of horizontal accountability. The only people you had to be accountable to were your bosses. Okay? I'm stylizing, but there is an architectural design principle here. Vertical accountability versus horizontal accountability. The second principle of the old regime was relative secrecy. Right? And the one big gift of the UPA government to this country was the Right to Information Act. But I don't mean secrecy just in the sense that we did not know what was going on in government and now we can find out. The balance of power in the knowledge production about society between government and society has changed considerably. 20 years ago, if your air was poisoned or your water was poisoned and government did not tell you it was poisoned, nobody would know it was poisoned, right? Now you will have every NGO, somebody in civil society pointing out that fact. So the structure of the production of knowledge about the working of society, that balance has completely shifted outside of the state hands, right? Okay? So instead of secrecy, you have knowledge. Instead of vertical accountability, a demand for horizontal accountability. India was one of the most centralized states in the world, administratively. Okay? And part of the challenge that we in Indian democracy, and this is going to be the toughest negotiation that we undergo over the next 5 to 10 years, is the fundamental question, what decisions should be taken at which level of government? Right? Now, ideally, normatively speaking, India would be committed to something like a subsidiarity principle, which is that those decisions should be taken at that level of government which are most appropriate to the nature and scale of that decision. Right? Why should state governments appoint school teachers? Why should municipal governments not have autonomy over their own affairs? Right? Okay. But and again, the 73rd, 74th Amendment started that conversation. But the fundamental design question of administration, what decisions should be taken at what level of government, right, is still very much up for negotiation. So centralization versus decentralization. And frankly, there still isn't the kind of momentum around decentralization that this, in a sense, country needs. The fourth big principle in this administrative of our old regime was wide discretion, right? And that went with a kind of regime of corruption, right? I like your face, I can allot you land, right? You have connections, I can give you the license to open a university, right? Okay? Now, one of the things that the deepening of our democracy has done is that it makes blatant discretion now harder to justify. There will always be discretion in government. I mean, frankly, this idea that you can have a government which doesn't need to exercise judgment, that can simply do things by formulas, I think is a pipe dream. Right? Governments always will have to exercise judgment, all things considered judgment. Otherwise, you would replace government with robots. But those decisions have to be justified at the altar of public reason. Right? What Professor Dadeep said, the deliberative democracy. Are all those people who are affected by those decisions, would they have consented to those decisions under conditions of free and equal deliberation? That is what would make that decision legitimate. Right? Now, we are in this interesting critical phase where from within our democracy, right, civil society movements, Aam Aadmi Party type of phenomenon, with all its problems, the demand is for an administrative structure that can actually create this transition. Vertical to horizontal accountability, secrecy to a knowledge-based governance system, centralization to decentralization, and discretion to public reason. Right? This administrative transition is not easy to bring about for a variety of reasons which we can go through. The two principal obstacles are, the first principal obstacle is that it is not in the interest of any incumbent political party or political system to be able to bring about this transition. Right? because the structure of their political power and their patronage power depends upon this transition not being complete. Right? Under democratic pressure, they will make 2 steps forward, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And it is not an accident. It is not an accident that no political party will invest in administrative reform, police reform, or judicial reform. Not a single one. Okay? Just sort of basic test of this. What we mean by reform right now is more power to the Prime Minister to take decisions, faster decisions, which is not the same thing as reorienting the architecture of the Indian state. The third reform, the third transition, which I'll mention briefly, but to my mind is conceptually more tricky, is the following, and it's related to the first one. In 1991, when we started the process of liberalization and reform, the idea was that that process will be part of a debate over what is the appropriate role of the state and what is the appropriate role of the market, right? That is the basic backdrop of that reform debate, right? That somehow the state was too heavy-handed in areas in which it should not have existed and not paying sufficient attention to other areas where it should have, right? And we certainly made a lot of progress in that direction. I think dismantling of the license permit Raj was a good thing. I do think India's integration into the global economy, by and large, is a good thing for India, right? But now with hindsight, one of the institutional distortions that our process of liberalization and the way we thought about it has produced is an utter confusion over the role of the public and the private. Now, one way of thinking about this role in first principles, and just grant me indulgence for 2 minutes because sometimes you do have to return to basics to get some clarity. What is the animating principle of creativity and legitimacy of different institutions of society? The state has creativity and the state has legitimacy because the state is backed by democratic legitimacy and it has the power of coercive sanction, right? That is the essence of a state, a democratic state, right? The private sector is creative precisely because, right, it is in search for profits. It's silly to say that the private sector should not search for profits. The source of its creativity and its institutional innovation is that it searches for profits. And civil society, the principle of legitimacy is voluntary agreement, right? We don't have the power of the state. We are not in search for profits. We don't have products to offer. We are not profit maximizers. Civil society is the arena where voluntary persuasion should work. You join my association because I've attracted you, because I can persuade you. Okay? Very elementary principles that underlie a kind of state. Now think of what has happened to our institutional architecture in the last 10 or 15 years, right? And then on this basis we decide, okay, what are the things that a market can deliver where profit is an appropriate motive? What are the things where voluntary persuasion is an appropriate motive? And what are the areas, right, where you need democratic legitimacy backed by the coercive power of the state to produce certain results? What has happened in the last 10-15 years is that there has been a complete confusion of form and function in the way in which the Indian state has come to be conceptualized. And that confusion of form and function is apparent perhaps most in a sector that is most critical to India's future, namely education, right? So, we first decide to neglect public education, not just neglect it in financial terms, but create an architecture of public education where it became impossible to hold public education accountable for any kinds of results, right? Whether it's in the school sector or whether it's in the higher education sector. As a response to that state failure, which was partly deliberately induced, we say, okay, we will allow private education to flourish, right? School education, now private school enrollments are touching up to 40%. Higher education, you all know the system. But It was privatization of education with a difference. As I said, one interesting fact which is close to 200 MPs, currently their primary source of income is running an education institution, which tells you something about the political economy of higher education in this country, right? Anyway, let's leave the political economy aside, let's look at the principle. Then we say, oh, by the way, we have a privatized education, and one of the consequences of privatized education is going to be greater disparity. It's inevitable with the privatized education system, right? Therefore, the private education system must now bear the burden of producing social justice, right? And normatively, I'm for the 25% reservation idea because you cannot have a segregated school system. I think that impulse was right. But in the creation of that architecture, right, we now want to say that we will hold the private sector accountable to those norms that are appropriate for the public sector. Think of the same principle in other areas of the economy. About 50% of the consolidated fund of India is now spent through private channels, right? Now, when you spend public money through private channels, there's obviously a demand that those private entities be held accountable. How will they be held accountable? By norms that are appropriate to the accounting for state entities, right? And you can do this sector after sector, whether it's why the PPP model broke down, why education, what you're getting is neither fish nor fowl. As we wrote in a paper, from half-baked socialism to half-baked capitalism, right? But across every sector of society, see, the public-private distinction is not just about what is true, what can the market produce and what can the state produce. It is also what is the form of accountability that is appropriate for that kind of activity. And I hate to bring this example up with Sachin Pilot here. We had very productive discussions of this. I frankly think this compulsory CSR rule is another violation of precisely that principle. Why should it be the state's business to now say to a sphere that should be a sphere of voluntary persuasion, please put all your money in Swachh Bharat, right? We get to decide what this sphere of voluntary persuasion will put its money in, right? So that progress that 1991 was supposed to have produced of actually clarifying the architectural principles is now all jumbled up, right? Rahul Gandhi is now leading a padyatra against electricity tariffs in Bombay, right? Now you have to decide, will electricity tariffs be subject to market forces? Will they be subject of administered prices? Or will they be the subject, right, of political accountability? University. Right now, most Indian investors don't know what our story is going to be. We have to almost kind of return to first principles, right? In the final transition, which I'll sort of end with, right? So there's the crony capitalism transition, the architecture of administration transition. Ask why are we still stuck in those same traps that our constitutions makers thought we would get out of. Okay? Now, there are two critical moves we need to make where I don't see a political constituency for either of them. One of the central tensions in the Indian Constitution and one of the central tensions in our politics, right, is between two different ideas of India. Now, the way this tension is often characterized is between Congress's idea of India and BJP's idea of India, which is a majoritarian idea of India versus a more inclusive, pluralistic idea of India. I think that's analytically a slightly misleading way of putting it. Congress has kind of sort of flirted with Hindutva elements, and the BJP is much more complicated. The central tension, right, is the following. We pride ourselves on being a tolerant nation. Right? Mr. Modi announced in Wembley, "Vividhata hi Bharat ki Atma hai." Okay? Let me submit to you that this phrase vividhata or diversity has become a source of muddled thinking about constitutional values. I'm all for diversity, believe me. Okay? But The challenges of toleration that India faces now are somewhat different from what it faced 30, 40 years ago. Clearly, a bedrock constitutional principle of any society should be nobody should be targeted for simply being who they are. Right? Any group or any society that violates that principle does not deserve to call itself liberal democracy. And the fact is, there are lots of forces in our society who target groups for simply being who they are, whether on the basis of caste or whether on the basis of religion. Okay? No compromising with that principle. But there is a deeper problem with the toleration issue. That the discourse of diversity that we inherited is actually very compatible with practices of segmentation and subordination. So हमारे यहाँ कहते थे यहाँ सब समुदायों के लिए जगह है, but there was a rider. अगर वो सब अपनी जगह में रहे, right? That is how our cities were configured. That is how our institutions were configured. Once you get economic growth, right, and there is a disembedding of individuals from their communal identities in certain respects, those community identities will matter to them. The challenges of toleration and discrimination are going to be very different. Now it's not, are you going to allow Muslims to live in a certain part of the city? That was easy to handle. वो वहाँ रहे जब तक ठीक है. If they don't cross boundaries, or even if they cross boundaries, they cross them along certain protocols. Right? Now, Hindus and Muslims are going to date and marry. Right? That's the inevitable process of modernization and disembedding of individuals from social forms. Right? We do not have a social or political force that can understand this kind of individual freedom. The discourse on diversity was very compatible with a very conservative understanding of what freedom meant. Right? अब विविधता भी भारत की आत्मा से काम नहीं चलेगा, अब स्वतंत्रता भारत की आत्मा है. Right? Where you say, and that is the core of deliberative democracy, sirf one basic core value of a democracy. What is the core value? As far as possible, nothing should be imposed on me that I do not consent to. Okay? Everybody says liberalism is a Western import. Right? We have a different conception of secularism. This is complete nonsense. Okay? Why is this a complete nonsense? Every community wants this right. RSS says, please don't impose legal reform of us if we don't consent to it. Right? Some minority groups say, please don't impose laws on us that we do not consent to. All we need to do in this democracy is just extend that courtesy down to every single individual. Right? Where if their community is imposing something on them, any individual has the right to contest that. Please do not impose it on my content. Right? That kind of moral individualism, Vyaktivad, right? That has no defender in Indian politics. I am now resident in the state of Haryana. You might say secular decline, transition from Rajasthan to Haryana. I do not see the difference between the Congress and the BJP as a difference between a progressivism and a reactionary force. The only difference is both believe in entrenched communal identities. Congress tried to run with both together, BJP occasionally lops off minorities. Right? The real struggle in India is not secularism, communalism as we conventionally understood. The real struggle in India is between forces of freedom and forces of orthodoxy. Okay? Even now, and I'm saying this because Sachin Pilot is here, when the toleration debate broke out, right? Many of us first thought one of the things the Congress party would do when it goes and petitions the president is stand up and say, here are 10 regressive laws that inhibit freedom in India. We realize we made a mistake in supporting those laws, in creating those laws. Let us stand behind and amend them. You cannot get the Congress party to do it. The law on sedition, absolute disgrace for a liberal democracy. Right? The restrictions on freedom of expression, the amendments, the Jawaharlal Nehru introduced, certainly need to be re-looked at. which political party will create a new legal and institutional charter for freedom. Don't look at what they say, look at what their institutional imagination is. So in this, when the Khap Panchayats thing broke out, frankly the differences in Haryana between BJP and Congress were not particularly great. And I understand politicians have constraints, you can't frontally take on forces of orthodoxy. But the real fight for the young generation here is cutting across Indian society. You're going to get now this conflict between forces of orthodoxy and forces of liberation intensifying. And our traditional political vocabulary of toleration is not enough to capture what is at stake in these forces. So that is the contest between two different ideas of India. Is India going to be a federation of congealed communities constantly doing the political arithmetic of head counts, or is India going to be a genuine zone of freedom? Okay? And I don't see our political discourse actually as, at the moment in a sense sort of catching up with them. Now, I'll just wrap up. I've gone on too long. To my mind, these are the four critical transitions that will define the fate of Indian democracy over the next years. I mean, I can talk of lots of others, the urban transition, the agrarian transition and so forth. But the reason I focused on these, and particularly the state capital one, right, as opposed to in a sense the agriculture to urban one, because that exercises disproportionate power on the prospects of economic development in India. The administrative architecture will decide whether these forces bubbling from the bottom actually get articulation in a new institutional imagination. Right? In fact, we are regressing on that institutional imagination in some ways, right? Okay? And whether the ideological context will edge towards an area where every single individual in this country feels safe, right, on account of who they are, they are not targeted on account for who they are, and can breathe the sweet and light air of freedom. Now ask yourself, which political party do you see, right, standing on the right side of all of these four transitions? Yeah? The second reason that makes me pessimistic is, and this is alluding to Professor Danish's argument, that there is this gap between the needs and demands and what's happening in political parties. Frankly, even if they are, even if they don't set, or let me put it this way, if political parties don't even set internal models of how to conduct democracy, it's going to be very hard to see how they're going to be champions of democracy in general, right? But the second thing that worries me, and this is a note I'll end with, since we are amongst elites, we are all privileged in relation to the rest of Indian society, is a lot of modern problems, whether it's the functioning of the economy, whether it's dealing with the environment, whether it's the form of urbanization you take, whether it's what kind of water systems you need, whether what kind of education system you need, require mediation of complex forms of knowledge, right? Those societies are successful that have the ability to internalize forms of knowledge, but more importantly, have structures of democratic conversation that at some point allow you to come to a resolution of these conflicts and differences. Amartya Sen calls Indians the argumentative Indians, and we all say this is a matter of great pride for us. India's vibrant democracy. Actually, there's a hidden joke in there. The dictionary meaning of argumentative is somebody who goes on arguing even after the matter has been settled. Okay, that is actually the literal definition of the meaning of the term argumentative, right? Okay. Now, elites matter a lot more in society because we exercise disproportionate power. There's no illusion of this. But if you have a structure of elite discourse and argumentation that's so argumentative on its scope that cannot come in all things considered solutions, then that society has a very bleak future in terms of how it's going to negotiate. Right? these different challenges. And I suspect one of the reasons why we are argumentative in this kind of way, and this is the last point, is the Achilles heel of our system, which is the education system. I suspect over the next 5 years, two things that make India competitive will probably be resolved somewhat satisfactorily. I think we'll probably do great progress in the power sector. We'll probably be okay in infrastructure. But education remains the biggest black hole of Indian competitiveness. Right? One of the reasons our economy is sluggish is not because there's just a shortage of skilled labor, but education and health are two areas where the rate of inflation is also the highest. All the increases are being absorbed now by private expenditure in these two areas. Right? Name me one political party in any state, even any state government, that you think has a credible plan for the regeneration of Indian education, both in terms of institutional architectures and in terms of pedagogical goals. Okay. I cannot think of any democracy at our stage of development that was so deeply confused about education and forms of knowledge mobilization. The task for us, political scientists, is to think about why it is that we are trapped in these transitions, and trap is the right word. We move forward, in part moving backward. And what are forms of mobilization that we necessary to make sure that we break out of these traps soon? Thank you very much.